After I took my first full length, I panicked when I saw that my score was a 505 because I was testing in a month, and I was especially concerned because I had already studied for 2 months and I only had a little bit of time before my exam. In this video, I'm going to share what allowed me to increase my score to a 512 on full length 1 after taking the free test, and this only took a week. And I ultimately scored a 513 on the actual MCAT exam only a few weeks later. I want to emphasize here that I completed all of my content review before taking the first exam, and because of that, the primary focus of this video will be test-taking strategies. First, I will discuss some broadly applicable test-taking strategies, and then I will tell you about my biggest regrets during the studying process, which Anki decks to use, and which ones to avoid, general information about test day, like what to bring, how the breaks work, what things are not allowed, and how to track your time. The 8-point increase in my score was not due to learning more content, but instead was due to a change in my mindset while I was taking the test. Specifically, I was able to improve at passage comprehension in all 4 sections of the exam. Something that isn't stressed enough is the importance of reading comprehension on the MCAT. My biggest failure in the first full length that I took was allowing myself to skim passages in cars and biochem. I think the only time it is acceptable to skim a passage is in the chemistry physics section of the exam, only really in specific types of questions too. So for example, it might be reasonable to skim a chem phys passage if it's clearly just a math question and it's going to just require a couple values that you can just fish out of the passage. And the reason that skimming a passage is so problematic is that it wastes your time. Just saying each word one by one at light speed in your head will not help you to answer the questions because you won't really grasp the main idea of the cars passages, and you will also miss important details in biochem that are sometimes required to interpret figures or to understand pathways. At best, you will find some details that are pertinent to the question by skimming, but at worst, you will waste a bunch of time and you'll also get stressed out because you were unable to understand anything from the passage. My car score went from a 124 to a 128 between these 2 full length exams because I slowed down my reading time. This is something you could change even if you were only a week out from your actual MCAT, but other strategy changes might do more harm than good if you're short on time. So, for example, I wouldn't try reading the questions first before the passage or making notes on your notebook if you're just a few days out from the exam and you haven't tried those things before on cars. Instead, just make sure that you're not skimming if you're in a little bit of a time crunch. This is the easiest and highest yield thing that you can change in a short amount of time. And it's the main thing that helped me improve, along with practicing lots of passages and using the AAMC question bank. The question bank is notoriously difficult, though, and my breakdown was a 63% overall. Don't get overly fixated on the percentages you get correct in the section bank or really any other question bank, but instead focus on identifying errors in your logic. I remember consistently looking up how a certain UWorld percentage or a AAMC question set percentage would translate to a specific MCAT score while I was studying, and I recognized that this was a little bit ridiculous after the fact. If anything, it's better to miss more questions while you're studying because you'll be able to review the answers. A lucky guess on a practice question could rob you of some valuable content review or passage analysis, so be grateful for your mistakes on the practice questions. To summarize, I was able to improve my score in a week by reading with a focus on comprehension instead of speed, and by practicing passage-based questions. It's important to note that I think it would take longer to make this large of a jump in a week if I had big content gaps. The next thing I want to talk about is Anki. I would recommend against the Miles Down Anki deck because it's too easy to get cards correct without understanding the answer. This is because the deck has a large number of cards with fill in the blanks, and it's easy to accidentally recognize the shape of a card's text or some key identifier like a word on the card instead of actually knowing the content. There is also just a large amount of information missing from the Miles Down deck or buried in a super long answer or figure on the back of a flashcard. So for that reason, I would just recommend sticking to the Jack Sparrow deck instead of the Miles Down deck because it's more exhaustive and it's a little bit more intuitive. The answer is just on the back side, not hidden in some picture. There's a few other decks you could think about, like the Iden deck, but this deck has spoilers from UWorld and the AAMC materials, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. You should just make your own flashcards for the missed questions anyways, in my opinion. But I will link where you can download these Anki decks in the description for free if you're having trouble finding them. Lastly, I'm going to talk about some things I wish that I knew for test day. The first thing is that watches are not allowed, so don't bring one, especially not a digital watch that can't turn off, because at the testing center, they ask you to turn off all electronics, but if your watch can't turn off, they get super weird, and it made me a bit nervous that I wouldn't be able to test, because the guy at the desk had to get someone else to analyze my basic Casio watch, and it was a little bit ridiculous. And looking back, it just added unnecessary stress to test day. Another thing to note is that you might start your test after the designated start time. I was supposed to start my test at 8 a.m., but I was getting pretty nervous because not everyone was seated in the exam room by 7:55, and there were like 5 people in front of me to be seated to take the exam, even though I got there 30 minutes early and was able to check in at the desk right away. I thought if I was seated after 8 a.m., I would lose some time or be penalized, but this is not the case. Don't worry if you aren't seated and started taking the test at your test time. As long as you check in at the desk, you won't be penalized. There's nothing to really stress about. So that's just something that's good to know. Might reduce some stress. It's also important that you ask for the time immediately after leaving the exam room for your breaks. If you're late to come back from your break, you will lose time on the next session because the exam will automatically start regardless of whether you're there when your break time runs out. You should also know that when you get back to your seat, the exam automatically starts. I heard a story where a test taker took some deep breaths to calm down after getting back from the break before the car section and discovered that she lost a few minutes of time because the test automatically started. It's not like the practice test where you kind of hit next. As soon as you sit down, the test taker signs you in and the test starts. In terms of food, I recommend bringing a bunch of snacks rather than a whole meal, like a sandwich or something, but it's really up to you. All I brought was a big container of peanuts, and then I went to a restaurant afterwards and just ate a bunch of food because I was starving. If you want to follow me on my journey to becoming a doctor, feel free to subscribe, feel free to like the video, and also take advantage of the fact that this is still a small channel, and feel free to ask some questions in the comment section because I will more than likely answer them.